I'm author and critic David Agranoff. I'm a horror and science fiction author, critic, and researcher. In this podcast, I aim to provide in-depth interviews and panel discussions with everyone from New York Times bestselling authors to researchers, musicians, and anyone I find interesting. Welcome to Postcards from a Dying World.
On this novel, right, so if you get a chance to go ahead and read their book, The Terraformers, with it is out from what publisher is that?
Tor,
yeah.
Oh
Yeah, I have it on hold from the library, and
it's really good. It's really fun.
Yeah, and it sounds great, and I'm definitely going to be reading that and covering that too. But you guys had an awesome book event at Mysterious Galaxies, and so that was really cool way to kind of kick off this book. Can you give everybody some background on this book and where it came from, and we'll get started talking about it.
Yeah, sounds good. So you're absolutely right that Meru is quite different from my first novel, Machinehood, in a few ways. Machinehood was very near future. It's a thriller. There's a lot of action. Meru is much more space opera, character focused. There's pretty strong element of romance and adventure. I like to call it epic science fiction because I think it has that kind of scope, and it's set in the far future, about 1,000 years from now. Still, within the realm of our world in terms of featuring Earth, the solar system, and extrasolar planets, including the title planet Meru. In this future, human beings have been confined to living on the Earth because it's the best place for them, while their post-human descendants, the alloys, who are genetically adapted to living and traveling through space, have sort of inherited the mantle of the explorers of the world. And when this planet Meru is discovered, it has a relatively similar atmospheric and other composition to Earth, and there are a few humans and alloys who start thinking maybe it's time for human beings to have a second home, and our title character and her pilot go off to test whether that theory is true.
Now we're going to drill down really deep onto this book, which of course is what I like to do on this podcast. It should be noted that this will most likely, if everything stays the way I think it will be one of my top reads of the year. I loved this. This was a great science fiction book. So if there's any question whether I'm recommending that people go and read this book, don't question. So a good thing to do is request it for your library as well. So if they don't already have it, if they don't carry 47 North books or whatever, put the word out to your librarians and let them know this is a book that they should be interested in. Is always something that I suggest. So we are going to drill down. So if you want to stay absolutely spoiler free, go read it, and you can pause it and come back. I'm going to try to keep the spoilers as far off to the edge as possible, but I might get into it just because I really like this book and it's a really great chance to talk about its creation. So, did you start with the world, or did you start with the characters? How did this organically come together? Was the idea, I mean, where did this book originate?
Where did this come from? So, so full disclosure, with Machinehood, I really struggled with the plot, which I invented from whole cloth and reinvented several times to finally get it to work. And so I decided for my next book, I'm going to steal a plot from somewhere else. And I started thinking about stories that I like that I think might be, that haven't been covered, especially in Western science fiction. And I stole the plot from a story within the Mahabharata about the characters Nala and Damayanti. And it's a story about romance, but also about moral choices and about really about the loyalty of love, I would say, and what a man and a woman might do for each other.
So is this a
And
classic folk? It's a classic folk tale, right? Or is it
I would say mythological tale. Yeah, the
mythological?
Mahabharata is a big epic, and it has many stories within it, just because it's got such a large scope. And this story is told to one of the main characters of the Mahabharata when he's having a sort of crisis of conscience. And so I took this very, very old tale that's, probably about 2 or 3 thousand years old at this point. And me being me, I didn't want to do a mythological retelling. I wanted to write science fiction. So I said, what else am I interested in right now? And I
So
wanted to do something space-based, and
right.
I wanted to do something involving posthumans because I love the idea of, where humanity might go from here. And so all of that kind of mashed up and turned into this book.
Right. And now, so was this story like a forbidden love? Because I mean, admittedly, I don't know this story that you're basing it from, which is one of the reasons why it's a good story to choose from, because Western audiences might not be familiar with it, right?
Right.
So was it a forbidden love story, or
It's
it wasn't it wasn't
no, it's not
transhuman
quite a
starships?
forbidden love story, but um, the reason I liked it as a story is that the main couple gets together pretty quickly.
Mm,
And so it's not about the two people coming together, which I think is where a lot of Western romance ends, right?
yeah.
Is kind of that slow burn, will they, won't they fall in love? And then you see it sort of happening, and then it sort of ends when they have declared their love for each other, and now they're going to go off and be a couple. Um, this is a story about two people who overcome some obstacles to become a couple, and then they get split apart by
Mm,
various external circumstances, and they have to find their way back to each other.
ah.
And even when they do get back together at the end, there have been a lot of complications along the way, and they're not even sure they should be a couple at that point. And so it's a much more complicated romance. And that really appealed to me as just because I wasn't writing this to write a romance, right? That's not the primary genre. It's really just the plot skeleton that I wanted to hang the story on. And I was like, that could be really interesting, especially in the context of space travel, right? You have these two people, space is vast. If they get split up across those kinds of distances, there's a lot of challenges potentially for them to surmount to find their way back to each other.
And I correct me if I'm wrong, but from when you were talking about this at the event, were you familiar with the story mostly from like a graphic novel adaptation, or was
Yeah,
I
there's a
hearing that wrong?
series of comic books that involve Indian mythology and fables, and even just famous historical personages. And I have, thanks to my parents and the dedication for buying me these, there was an Indian grocery in the San Fernando Valley that we used to go to like once a month. And so I would rifle through whatever comics they had. And if they had one I didn't have that looked good, I'd beg my parents to buy me one. And so I have a small collection of them, and this was one of them.
Which is cool because the fact that you mentioned this, and I maybe it was the acknowledgments, but I did look them up and spent a little time like thumbing through some of the amazing artwork, and it was really cool to see because it's something I obviously hadn't heard of before, so it was neat.
Right. Yeah.
Well, no, that's cool to pay off that influence too as well, because one of the neat things here that you're doing is one of the things that I always like in an author who brings unique things to the table that, this is a book that only you could write, for example, right? Like a ton of science fiction writers could have this idea, but they're never, your unique spin is what, you bring to the table. And it's one of the great things about this book, right? Is, and anytime an author can find a way to, create a world for us that is uniquely theirs, like that's an automatic attraction for me anyways. So especially in science fiction, love it. So, and I think this book even more so than well, Machinehood kind of had that in the sense of your scientific background and and that. So so I wouldn't say less so. Okay, anyways, I'm getting off on a tangent here, but well, it is really cool that you were able to do this book event at Mysterious Galaxies, because you and Annalee's books have this kind of through line of colonialism in it, and I'm sure that was an outgrowth of just the world building, right? Like that maybe not wasn't the original intention in writing this book, right?
So. No, it was, I would say, colonialism and environmentalism were both pretty top of mind when I was.
The environmentalism is very clear. Yeah. And we'll get into that. Yeah.
Yeah. But even colonialism, and I think we touched on this a little bit at the Mysterious Galaxy discussion in terms of science fictional tropes when it comes to space exploration. It's often taken for granted that we will colonize every planet we can come across as long as we can make it habitable, and that was definitely something I wanted to interrogate.
Right. Well, it is every once in a while when you're reading the retro stuff, they'll see like one line here or there where somebody questions it, but for the most part, it took science fiction many decades to start to do that, and I do feel like now we're getting more of that. Meru is one of the things that I love about reading modern science fiction. Like, I'm a retro sci-fi guy, and I love that, and I love seeing what people in other eras were thinking about our future. Is always fascinating. But one of the things that keeps me, reading the modern stuff is that you get a chance to push the genre forward into new directions that we just weren't doing in the in the retro era. They still had a lot of things holding them back from like the cultural norms of the time, right? And what publishing was at the time, and it's just a thing that I really appreciate about this. But one of the challenges that you had in writing this book was going ahead 900 years, right? Is a very big challenge, because if you, and when I say that, it's like, oh, well, science fiction writers always think about the future, but 900 years, it's not quite Dune territory, right? It's not that far away. And you said that, you still have connections to Earth and all that. However, 900 years ago to us is going to look like a very different humanity and different world. So projecting 900 years, can you tell me about your process of projecting 900 years in the future and how it related to this book?
Yeah, I wanted the book to feel like it would to somebody from 900 years ago being transplanted into present times, right? Where certain things are familiar, you still see people walking around in clothes, and we're eating food and drinking drinks and having children and having pets and houses, certain basic things that human beings need. But then you have these, incredible machines, you have wireless communication, you have video, you have all kinds of technological advancements and creations that would be completely baffling to someone from 1,000 years ago. And so I was hoping to give the reader a similar sort of experience where there are certain touchstones that they can still very much relate to, but then there's other things that are just absolutely wild, while still mostly inhabiting the laws of physics that we understand today. I did expand them a bit, because I needed some sort of space travel mechanism. And, I think a lot of science fiction writers like to come up with their own ways of doing that.
Mhm.
I don't know, or at least I do.
Yeah,
I didn't want to rely on the typical starship or warp drive or, ion engines or the things that have already come before. And because I was really fascinated with post-humanism and bioengineering and genetic engineering, I was like, what sort of physics can I invent and biology can I invent such that there's a whole new type of space travel in this world?
absolutely. And I kind of think we have to talk about that before we get into spoilers, but and I don't think that's that big of a spoiler, but with the alloys who are they're human-ish, right?
Yeah,
They're
very ish.
ish. They're descendants of ours, but they've evolved using and look, it's a really interesting thought experiment for science fiction because as we get into the future of technology, we already have the ability to manipulate our bodies in ways that 100 years ago, 200 years ago, you couldn't do. Like, um, you know, um, and I'm kind of joking, but the fact that Tom Brady's still playing football at 45 is crazy. And then there's people who eventually will be able to um almost transcend this species by like becoming something else, and this is something that you really exploit with the alloys. So can you talk about them, because I saw them as, and I was talking to a friend who was asking me about this book as I was reading it, and I started trying to explain the alloys, and I said, well, yeah, they're human adjacent
Right.
because they definitely came from us, but they don't see themselves as, they see humans as being a very different thing. Can you talk about the building, the world building behind the alloys and how they relate to this book?
Yeah, so as I said, I really wanted to explore this idea of post-humans in the sense of, you know, what might be the next evolutionary step, right? So we still have Homo sapiens in this world. We have
Yeah.
people that look like you and me. It's just that most of them are confined to the earth. Um, but who's going to inherit potentially the mantle of the social roles that we occupy today? And given what is happening with genetic engineering and given what's happening with cybernetics, I kind of wanted to fuse the two. And I was like, what if we could actually, we already know that we can encode information in DNA. What if we get to the point where we can add DNA, right? We can add another chromosome to the human genome to extend it into something totally not human anymore. And we can programmatically set that up to build all kinds of structures, right? So I have alloys who have, extended memory. They have wings and skin that can absorb solar energy, and they have lungs that electrolyze water using the electricity drawn from their wings. They don't have to breathe air anymore because of that, right? Because
Mhm.
their energy comes from sunlight. And I kind of let myself play a little bit and said, we often in science fiction spend a lot of time looking at really advanced gadgets and machinery. Um, and not to say that there aren't stories that play with biology, there definitely are. But I really wanted to look at it from, a more realistic standpoint of like, if we were actually going to accomplish this, how would it come about? And so I got into the genetics of things a little bit more, and at the same time decided I wanted to enjoy myself as a world builder and really kind of set myself free of the standard model of advanced humanity.
Well, one of the things I enjoyed here too was, and I know this is not a trick that every science fiction reader can do, but even if something didn't make immediate sense to me, I'm okay with that. Like as a reader, like if I'm like, yeah, I'm not sure I understand what's going on here, I usually can flow with it, and sometimes like it'll come to me later. I did think that this book was very clear about the world building, about what was going on with alloys. I didn't have to do that trick as much in this book. There were a few times where I like had to slow down and reread something and be like, oh, okay, that's how this works. But it's partially because you're doing so many interesting, fun thought experiments, which is one of the things that's fun about the book. There's lots of stories that could be told in this universe, because there's lots. I mean, even beyond these characters, if you were eventually to do a novel about an alloy, or to do something like you've created a very intense world. And I think I'm sure that you've probably, I know how it works for writers. I'm sure you've probably got like 1,000 ideas that have popped off from there,
Yes,
right? Yeah.
for sure. Not just for other stories in this universe, though I definitely have some of those.
Yeah.
But I'm already starting to think about even, other worlds I can build, because the world building exercise is something that I really love about
Mhm.
writing science fiction and fantasy. But for what the publisher is calling, we've decided to call the alloy era books. Um, the model in my head was really something more like Ian Banks's culture novels, where it's not so much um, a connected series and like an ongoing story arc, but really a set of linked stories set in this universe.
Amazing. And I'm all here for it. Yeah, I think that's the way to go. And I'm really excited to watch this alloy era build. Um, so one of the things going on with the alloys to not allies, alloys, is that because they are not human in, well, because, well, for one thing, as an outgrowth of them not being human, that their bodies function differently, they're able to take on different jobs. So for example, the fact that there are these pilots who are basically like living starships. um and then it gets into an interesting thing, because I'm sure you thought about this. If they're not breathing, and if they're existing in space, are they living in a sense that we think of? I'm sure you had that debate in your head, right? Because I thought about that a lot while I was reading this book. Like, I consider them to be living, because they're thinking, they're emotional beings. They just don't like depend on the earth like we do, for example,
Right,
right?
right. They're still largely organic, in
Yeah.
the sense of being, pretty heavily carbon, hydrogen, oxygen based, but then um, they have other elements like silicon, iron, titanium that are part of their bodies. So it is kind of a fusion of both. But they are very much living. And, to your point of thinking about that question of what is life, right? I'd been looking at some astrobiology and really trying to interrogate, what do we mean when a thing is alive? And it turns out that there's not really a set agreement among scientists yet on how to define life. So I took the liberty of defining it myself for this book, so that people at least know, the operating rules of the world that I've built.
Right. Now, one of the parts with the how the pilot ship, because they're people, but they're so in a way they're almost like, I kind of thought of them as almost like kaiju size, that they're like these like,
Yeah,
yeah, big
giant
people.
people.
And then they use these constructs, which are almost like, and this is one where I was like, I wasn't sure if I was reading it correctly, but I always took the constructs to be like avatars that they use to like
Oh,
kind
the
of get,
incarns.
yeah, to get on incarns, yeah, to get
Hmm.
on a human level, right?
Yes.
and this becomes important because of how two of the characters interact, the pilot and our main character Jay. So, or is it Jaya?
Jaya, yeah.
Yeah, Jaya and her pilot like have this kind of relationship where it's through the incarn. And so that was a really neat like thing to think about, and I really liked how it was thinking about the world, whereas if you're an alloy and you're like huge and you like operate as a starship, you would want this avatar type thing to communicate and to exist on that with the people that that are traveling inside of you, right?
Right.
So that was neat. I really like that. But that also goes into one of the neat things about and we've talked about this a lot with modern science fiction and a lot of the discussions that I have with all kinds of different writers, which is if we have just standard gender things going on and you're doing far future things, what are you doing? Because already like our gender norms are changing. And one of the things that thankfully, and so one of the things that's going on with the alloys is that for especially for the pilots, that there's no reason for them to have any kind of traditional like gender roles, right?
Right.
So and this presented an issue for you for writing because you're just people don't think about how often they use pronouns in writing. I'm sure as you got into it, um you know the pronouns that these alloys use in the book, it's not that it's an issue because it goes away very, very quickly for the reader, but I'm sure it's a thing that you had to that you put thought into as you were writing it, and also to be respectful to these characters that you're creating, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it was an interesting question for me for the alloys because they've effectively become asexual. They don't reproduce sexually with each other the way we do. They use artificial wombs and they construct genomes entirely from scratch, from design. That's sort of the way, we might build a computer chip, right? Very
Right.
complex device, but we design it from the gate level up. And so there will, I believe, come a day when we can do that with DNA. And so at that point, it begs the question, like why throw this to chance, right? And I wanted, so once you get to that point, it's like gender becomes a choice. And even having certain secondary sexual characteristics and physical characteristics can potentially be a choice. And so there are some alloys who choose to inhabit traditional human genders, right?
Yeah.
And then there are humans who have traditional human genders as well as non-binary genders. And then you have alloys who choose to be agender. And so I had to really think about the pronouns a bit. And I decided for the human non-binary folks to just go with they, them, because that's where a lot of people are settling today, not universal, but it's fairly common. And then I went with Zer, Spivak pronouns for the agender alloys, including one of the main characters. And it's interesting to me because way back when I wrote my novella Runtime, which was in 2014, I used those same Zer pronouns for humans. This is set in the relatively near future, a decade or two from now. And I didn't get a lot of pushback at the time. But with this novel, even though it's been, almost a decade since I wrote that one, there's definitely a section of the readership who picked it up and basically put it down saying, I can't even with these pronouns. And I think, what's happened in the interval in terms of public discourse around this, it has become so much more politicized over time
Okay,
that
I see. Yeah.
for a lot of these people, I have a screenshot that I was thinking I need to capitalize on for publicity at some point. That is a 1-star review from Amazon with the subject "Woke as woke can be."
Yeah.
And I make no apologies for it. But it's like that's not what I was trying to
Ron
do with this. I'm
DeSantis would
like, I'm
hate
not
this
trying
book.
to be
Yeah.
woke.
Yeah.
However, at the same time, I do embrace the ideas that gender can exist on a non-binary complex surface, right?
Right.
And I definitely wanted to be inclusive of that in this story.
No, well, and it's funny too, because just from a nuts and bolts of writing is a lot of times when you pick up like, okay, I'm going to use these pronouns, I'm going to do this, is it becomes, you become so aware of writing with it that sometimes you have to be careful not to overuse, because you're very locked into using it. And what was great for me about this book is how natural they became for me. So I'm sure there are some readers like, whoever wrote the Woke as Woke could be, who are just not going to be able to handle that. But, well, this book's not for them anyway. So, there is that, um, as far as for me, like I enjoyed that aspect of the book. So I, whatever. I can't even with those people, but but for me, and look, Ron DeSantis like hating your book because it's woke would probably be a great thing. So if we can, if woke is the, whatever. Anyways, I got to move on because that's just going to drive me nuts. But one of the things with the alloys and with that aspect of the story that is that, some of the critics or the people who are afraid of this kind of world building, they are very afraid of thinking about a world. There are some science fiction readers, most science fiction readers would embrace, even if like, hey, that's not the world I want to live in, I want to explore this world, right? And so these people who are afraid of this future, that's how they're going to react to these things. Whereas for me, like, I really enjoyed, exploring this world. And I think that's one of the things, about this book, is that it is very character focused, but it's also just a really fantastic setup for this world. And you can see that you're going to be seeing that in other stories for a long time. Before we get into nitty gritty with spoilers, let's make a last pitch for those of you, excuse me, who listened this far, who haven't read yet. If we haven't told you already, I don't know what we need to do. I guess point to the Woke as Woke could be 1-star review. I for me, I love a really good exercise in world building, and to me it feels like, and I also really love when I can tell a writer is having a lot of fun. I imagine building this world was a lot of fun for you.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
And I wrote the book in the summer of 2020 when I needed some joy and escape in my life. So
Yeah.
it is very far removed from present reality, unlike some of my other fiction.
Right. And that's the thing is Machinehood's like very ripped from the headlines type
Right.
thing with AI, and there's a lot of like really heavy concepts, right? Of
Right.
like what is what is alive and what isn't, and when we're going through all like, and I don't know. I mean, just today I saw someone use the chat bot.
ChatGPT.
Yeah, too. They said like write a joke like Philip K. Dick, and and it was funny because the joke was pretty funny. I will give them that. And but at the same time, like I was just like, with Machinehood, you have a lot of what's going on in the real world, like projected. Right. And what I think the escapism and all the right ways of Meru is really excellent. It's not that it's not thoughtful and it doesn't have thoughtful things going on, but it is definitely an adventure and a world building character wise. So on that note, we're gonna get more nitty gritty about the actual writing of this and get into spoilers. So if you haven't read the book yet and you don't want to be spoiled, this is your absolute 100% last warning. We're going to talk about characters. We're going to talk about who does what and all that starting now. So obviously this is a love story between a human and a starship. So if you get down to it, but
yeah, though I don't think of the alloy as a starship. Z is very much a person, just a person on a scale that we aren't used to thinking about people being. But we have had very large animals on Earth, right? We're okay with thinking of a dinosaur as person. So just think of a very, very complex spacefaring, well, I have a picture right here, merfairy looking person who happens to be 150 meters tall.
Yeah. Now, and well, look, that kaiju sized,
right.
and they deserve,
or mecha sized, right?
Mecha sized, right? Yeah, and look, I'm not saying that disparagingly. I thought it was neat, as far as and I do think that some people, if you say it's a story of a love story between a woman and her starship, and not in a metaphorical sense,
no.
like, because we know Kirk loves the Enterprise, right? But
right.
Not that
way.
Not that
romantically.
Not romantically. And I don't know. Some people might disagree, but that being said, I know that wasn't sort of the intention when it came about, but their relationship was very much a part of it. But I think you said you kind of liked the idea of it wasn't so much about their romance as they're being separated and they're having to come together, and find their way to each other. But the decision that they would have a child together, was that early in the concept, or because the child is a lot of the kind of MacGuffin that kind of moves the story forward? Because, well, I guess we can get into the plot a little bit. So let me rewind a little bit. So the story is that alloys want all humans to stay on Earth, right? And that is the environmental aspect of it. And that is one of the things that I really enjoyed in this story was, look, as a struggling not to be misanthrope environmentalist, I related to the alloys more than I did the humans, because in this story, the alloys don't really want the humans coming off of Earth because they already fucked up Earth and they almost fucked up Mars. And so, like, we're not going to let you go off into the other thing. So kind of explain to me, like, where you came to the idea of the alloys being the spacefarers and the humans being, like, kind of confined to Earth. Like, where did that come from?
So some of the inspiration came again from that old mythological story, because as with a lot of mythologies and polytheistic religions like Hinduism, there are many gods, and they often interact with the humans, and the gods kind of have their abode and the humans have the earth. And so that kind of spun off into this idea of the alloys being the ones living in space, right, with the humans being the ones living on Earth. And I was thinking about it from I was thinking about terraforming, the idea that we would change the environment to suit ourselves, which is something we do, frankly, right now, right? Everybody wants the ultimate climate controlled environment, whether it's the car, the house. Like, we never want to be out of our 5 or 10 degree comfort zone if we can help it.
Yeah.
And And then I was thinking about the converse, it's like, especially once you get into genetic engineering, why not change the person to be comfortable in the environment rather than the other way around? Because the way we're doing it now tends to be very destructive to the environment, right? It's much better if we could change ourselves to just fit where we live. And so that's kind of where this idea came of, well, we don't fit well in space. As much as we love the idea, I personally would sign up tomorrow to be a space tourist if I could afford it. But the truth is, space is an incredibly hostile place for
Right.
our current bodies, right?
We were
Like,
designed for this planet.
yeah, we evolved via natural selection to fit this planet, this ecosphere. And so I
And
was
by
like,
design,
well,
I meant by evolution, by the way. I should be clear.
and so then I did think about, well, okay, so what if we do have directed evolution? What if we can design other types of beings? Can we design our children's children's children to be well suited to living in the vacuum of space? And so that's where kind of the alloys can live. They're not building, giant space stations. There's no Death Stars. There's no enterprises. They can literally just hang out in vacuum and they're fine because
Yeah.
that's how their bodies are designed. And yeah, so I think that kind of answers that question of, like, how does it fit with the ecology? Because in the vacuum of space, you can't really hurt anything. You can still trash it. So they try to minimize, the amount of stuff they have. They try to minimize the types of structures they have to build, and the amount of resources that they have to extract in order to support themselves. And I think I mentioned this at Mysterious Galaxy, that I wanted to look not at a post-scarcity utopia, but a post-necessity utopia where
Mm,
we just don't need a lot of the stuff anymore, right?
right.
And much of it becomes most of the alloys, the majority of them live in a condition called stasis, where they are basically inhabiting a virtual mind-based environment, and they don't need a lot of physical stuff.
We would need to change how we live to survive that far in the future with as many people as we have. So I think exploring that version of the future is a really exciting path for science fiction. So, and now the relationship between Jaya
Uh-huh.
and Vaha is very, it's interesting because Vaha is set up to basically sabotage the mission. So the idea is that Jaya is going to go to Meru to try and prove that humans can be trusted to go to other worlds. And some of the other pilots that are offered this job, they turn it down, and they basically come to Vaha and say, we want you to mess this up. We want you to, help us prove that humans can't make it. But that change of heart happens very quickly. If you talk about building Vaha as a character, because not only do you have to build a character who isn't human, who doesn't have the same kind of motivations, but you're putting them in like kind of two interesting parallel tracks. One, being given this shady mission, and then also like having a change of heart. So building this character must have been very, very, very important for you in the process.
Yeah. So Vaha's character doesn't have a lot of strong opinions to start. He is very much sort of what's the right word? Low self-esteem, low self-confidence type of person, right? And so the evolution of this character is to go from that to having confidence and to, having convictions by the end of the story. And it's a lot about what are those convictions. And Vaha's best friend, who's also a pilot, is very anti-human for some background reasons.
Right.
And so, early
I'm
on in the
holding
book, the
up
two of them,
page 61, which is the scene between them.
between them, yeah. So
Yeah.
the two of them fight early on. They have this fight, especially when Baja says that he's going to take this mission to take this human to Meru, and Baja's friend is like, "You can't do that," like, and feels very much like their friendship is being betrayed by this action. And then, since we're talking spoilers, so later on, Kaliu feels justified then in betraying Baja again, right, and sabotaging the mission. And so, writing Baja's character, yeah, I mean, writing the alloys in general, it's very interesting, and I try to deliberately do things to shake myself out of falling into the trap of them being too human. I mean, they still are human. They still have, again, 2/3 of their DNA
Right.
characteristics, and their chromosomal characteristics are human. So they still have emotions. They still have certain elements of our biology. But at the same time, they have ways to self-regulate those emotions. They communicate differently through chromatophores because there's no air in space, you can't talk. They have different priorities, right? And they have different social norms. And so, as much as possible, I try to bring those into the story and into the foreground so that not just for me, but also for the reader, you're kind of hopefully continually reminded that these are not human people, right? They're still people and they're still related to humans, but they are not going to react to situations the same way we are.
Yeah, and the book is filled with little details about, where you'll go, oh yeah. When you're, because a lot of times I find when I'm reading quick and I'm going through, sometimes like I will, it's funny because like in this book there were a lot of times where I got anchored in by like, oh yeah, that's definitely not one of the human characters, and and it got me to slow down a little bit, because like a lot of times when I read really fast, I shorthand some things in my mind just because I like reading quickly. And then what was cool about this book was it did make me slow down and be like, really pay attention to the details of how these characters interact. One thing that was interesting too is Jaya's parents are not human.
Correct.
She was raised by alloys, and it made me, I had some uncomfortable thoughts about that, in the sense of, and I'm wondering how you feel about this, but I wondered if it was kind of like that, if her parents or if the alloys didn't see it similar to the relationship that, and look, I'm a person that does not like the word pet, that prefers companion animal, and like considers my dogs a part of my family. And I love my dogs, but I wondered if they kind of had like a kind of, not the way I personally look at it, but the way certain people have like a pet master philosophy towards the humans that they're raising. I wondered a lot about that while I was reading those scenes between her and her parents, is what I'm saying. I wonder.
Yeah, I would say from a world building standpoint, right? Alloys being people are not homogenous in their views. And
Yeah,
so, and I try to represent that where some
sure.
of them, some of the alloys and even some of the humans definitely see it as a, um, caretaker pet type relationship. Some of the alloys see it more, I would say, see their dynamic with humans more as parent child, or, caregiver and child, or potentially, as like early, right in chapter one, Jayanti's meeting Hamsa, who's her mentor, right? And Hamsa is also an alloy and a friend of her parents. And so there's also a little bit of, mentor mentee or teacher student types of relationships there. And I think that's where, Jayanti and Baha's romantic relationship gets really interesting because they see each other as equals. And they don't at the beginning, right? She sees Vaha as naturally superior because that's kind of how she's come to conceptualize alloys.
Yeah.
And Vaha, on the other hand, sees her as something fragile that, is a responsibility of Zer's, but then later comes to greatly admire her and actually think of her as superior to Vaha in some ways. So I think they have a really interesting dynamic, and ultimately they find equality with each other, right? Like they find equal footing. Footing is something that an alloy would not say. That was, the hardest part for me was getting away from human-centric idioms.
Yeah.
And also earth-centric idioms, right? Like taking a deep breath. Like there's no alloy in space is not going to take a deep breath ever because there's no air.
Right. Well, I cannot stand in science fiction in Star Trek or Star Wars when somebody says like the most important person in the world to me. And I'm just like, it makes me want to pull my hair out. It's like no one would ever say that if their context is to live on multiple worlds, right?
Right.
Or that they
or they wouldn't say Earth, at least. I mean, the world to me can encompass the entire universe, right? It doesn't have to just be the planet.
Yeah,
but
I'm just saying, I see the same thing. Like
right.
Greg Cox, who's a Star Trek author, he and I always joke about that because I he thinks it would be distracting to write that stuff into Star Trek if somebody said like the most important person in all the worlds instead of world.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas like, and we kind of jokingly debate about this one all the time because I think it should be. I like the Battlestar Galactica approach where I'm going to change it to make it fit the world because that's the way it should be. Now, that being said, now when I said I like to drill down nerdy, we're going to drill down nerdy on page 142 of Meru. Because 142 is where the romance starts to popping. But there's a whole bunch of little things, and I pointed out this page when I was reading. I dog-eared this page because I was like, we're going to talk about this page. Because there's a couple things that happened on there that I want to talk about that build off what you were just saying. Like an alloy's not going to think that way. So it's funny because I noticed, and maybe nobody else would notice, maybe this will just be me, but there's a lot of talk about their pores, the alloys, how their pores react to things. But it was enough that I was like, okay, now I want to drill down on like what I think I know what you were thinking, but I want to talk about that.
Oh, there are fours. Okay. I say fours in my head from chromatophore, Phore.
Yeah.
Fours. Okay.
Yeah. So not pores, sorry, fours. So yeah, so I wanted to get into that because this is, you know, Vaha's fours saturated with purple. That's on 143. This is the scene. This is an important scene because this is where they first start saying like, "Hey, are you romantically interested in me?" Which is great because it's so awkward because it's between two species. So like, basically, there's like a, "Hey, you know," and
how do you read these signals? It's not as intuitive, right?
Yeah, right. And as somebody who my I've been married for 20 years, but my wife and I's marriage is very awkward, how a lot of things happen, and so I related to this. So
okay, great.
But yeah, so how this the force thing. So I just wanted to drill down on that. So like when you were talking, this is just a nitty-gritty thing about how their bodies work, right?
Right.
So
so again, this is from, I started thinking about, I have these people like hanging around in space, right?
Right.
And they're not in a spaceship. There's no air. They can't talk. So then I was like, how are they going to communicate with each other? I mean, sure, it could be electronically, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they do have that. They have these EM channels and EM talk where they can communicate in an electronic way. But I was like, I want something more organic. And so I started, our planet has a wealth of really fascinating life forms that are very different from us. We really don't have to go find aliens because they're here. And so I started thinking about underwater, right? I'm a scuba diver. And it's like, well, how do creatures communicate underwater? And a lot of them use light. And, um, cetaceans, you have chromatophores, and they can change the color of their skin. And then you have, creatures that are bioluminescent that can glow. And so I put the two together and said, okay, they can flash at each other at, various spectra, and then they have color on top of that to indicate mood, because we express mood a lot with with our facial muscles, right, and in body positions. And so rather than just using those same exact cues, because again, I feel like their faces, even if they have humanoid faces, aren't going to be, you're not necessarily even going to have a well lit view of the other person's face if you're an alloy, right? Because again, space. And so I was like, color is mood, and frequency and flashing, because I come from a communications background. And like, you can modulate the chromatophores, you can modulate the glows in different ways to have very nuanced communication, I think, and which an advanced intelligent species is going to need. And that was a really fun part of the world building, was sitting there and coming up with the color code scheme. And yes, I totally did that. I have a color chart where I wrote out, I found like this color chart for like, I think like from a paper company, where they name a whole bunch of colors and they have little dots. And so I printed that out and I started making
And I don't
notes
know
about what maps to what, so that I could be consistent, because I was like, there's no way I'm going to remember this across 400 pages of a manuscript.
Well, and look, this reader is also a writer who loves world building, so maybe that's why I'm the one that noticed it, but or I'm one of the people that notices this. But I loved this detail. It was something that
I had an
I caught
autistic
on to.
reader who commented, I think, I don't remember if it was on Mastodon or Twitter, about how they were so happy to have this like color coding emotional interface, right? Like there's a system there and you can figure it out.
Right. Well, and one other thing on 142 that makes it a page that I notice is one real neat function of how the romance happens is this idea that Vaha is questions herself on this idea that maybe it's just my incarn that has feelings for you, right? And I loved that. I loved this idea that maybe it's just that
this
part
body.
of me,
Right?
right, because that's the part that's more like you. And like, and it was really interesting world building way to have a complication in the romance, right. And so I love that. That was a neat detail. That was an A+ thing for me. I'm pretty sure I wrote about that in my review as being like one of the things that really, like a lot of things sold me on this book, but that was one scene that just really got me. And because that's one of the times where I really felt like you were making real the differences between these two people who were having feelings for each other, but were also in an awkward situation where they didn't know or understand how to make sense of that. So, and look, there's a lot of things I relate to with the look, there's some things going on with Jaya then in the story where they get separated, and she doesn't know if Vaha is really had these feelings for her. Right. And she's going to go through with the pregnancy and then meets these other humans that are in this other situation. This other station or situation that was going on. Well, and I like this too, because there's a lot of thought being put to recently in science fiction, whether it's like Kim Stanley Robinson and Aurora, about pointing out how important Earth is to us and how hard it would be to survive in space.
Right.
And so this community that's out there
It's on a mega construct, which is much more like an actual spaceship, right? Giant
Yeah.
cylindrical, rotating, like traditional large starship, but
But
sentient, but also
yeah,
sentient.
yeah.
Not
But
alive, but sentient.
they're trying to say like, hey, and it's kind of patronizing too, where it's like, hey, we're trying to prove that humans can be out here and can do this
Right.
thing, right? And I liked that part of the story was really good, and I really related to this idea that well, one of the other things that I kind of related to here going on in this part was, at no point did you ever like put nations into this or say like this is part of the United States or these other things.
Right.
Like
Very intentional.
right. And so I just really appreciated that as far as it's funny too, because I one of the things I've been studying, one of the books that Philip K. Dick had rejected, one of the editors told him like, what country, kept saying, what country is this?
Uh-huh.
And he was, and like in one of the letters back, he wrote back, he was like, what do you mean country? I'm not talking about countries here.
Right.
They don't have those anymore.
Right.
Right. And so he was doing that. He was trying to do that in the 60s and getting pushback. But here's the thing: did anyone in your orbit of the editors or anybody want you to drill down on any of this, or were you given freedom to do this?
Yeah, nobody objected to the lack of nationality. Nobody objected to the various types of gender identities. Um, yeah, no, I actually had a really great editorial experience with this book. No pushback. Most of the edits were done more focused on characterization,
Right.
making motives and that kind of thing consistent and understandable throughout. Um, Little things on the world building, but no, I mean, honestly, I think I've been lucky with all three of my books in that I've always had excellent editorial support. The hard part has been finding a buyer.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
but once the editor has been captivated by the book, they have not pushed back on any of those kinds of details. And I think, to your point, a lot has changed, right, between the 60s and
Yeah.
today in terms of not just the publisher, but really, who they're publishing for, right? The audience, the general discourse on these topics, other books. We've got solar punk, we've got hope punk, we've got cli-fi. We have so many subgenres that are tackling similar kinds of topics, right? And then we
Right.
have, the techno utopians, and who are after their, like, speaking of the culture novels, right? Post scarcity, everything in abundance. We can have whatever we want, whenever we want types of stories as well. So I think the discourse within the literature has definitely shifted.
Totally. Absolutely. And I love the fact that there wasn't any. Yeah, I mean, even there's a certain Western feel to um, Star Trek, for example, that is one of the things that makes me uncomfortable about it. But and I'm a big Trekkie, but one of the things that I loved that a couple of years ago there was a guy who did a whole series of science fiction novels about a spacefaring Aztec culture, right? And I was like, why the hell not?
Yeah.
Like, why the hell not? Um, and I would like to see more science fiction where there's this idea that like, you know, different cultures from this planet expand into space as their culture,
Right.
and are happy with it, right?
Right.
Like, why not? Let's do more of that. And then, so yeah, and I really, well, and in particular sense of this book, it seems like we're just beyond that 900 years from now. We're just like those little details of this nation and that nation.
So
we got bigger
I,
things to think about.
yeah, and I didn't get into it explicitly, but one of the ideas I wanted to explore in this universe is moving away from property ownership. So in addition to um, aspirational type disorders that people get treated for, there's possessiveness, there's avarice disorders, there's this idea that needing to own things or needing to own too much is a treatable condition, right? I get into that a little bit more in book 2, which focuses much more on Earth and what's happened with human society, because Meru doesn't really touch on that other than superficially.
Are we going to learn more about the directed mutation catastrophe?
Not so much, because that's in the distant past. That would be like, a book set today talking extensively about medieval history, right?
Okay.
It's not that it's a thing that happened that has shaped the society subsequently, but it's not in the forefront of people's minds. But you will get glimpses of what some of the things that have happened on Earth, between today and the setting of this world.
Just how my brain works, I dog-eared
yeah.
that page and circled that and was like,
Yeah, I think that would have to be its own book set, closer to that time period, right? Like that could be a really fascinating addition
what went wrong
to this
on Mars,
universe.
right? That was Mars, right? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, Mars. Well, Mars was a terraforming
You've definitely thought that
catastrophe.
out. I could tell.
The directed mutation catastrophe had to do with the perils of genetic engineering, right? People are already talking about where do we draw the lines? How do we avoid the pitfalls of eugenics? And I'm like, we may not avoid all the pitfalls along the way. We may have some pretty terrible things that happen along the way. And so that's where the DMC, the directed mutation catastrophe, came from. And we have to learn our lessons, sometimes the hard way, unfortunately.
Another pivotal scene that's one of my favorite scenes in this book is on page 355, and this is the scene where Jaya and I'm going to pronounce it. Is it Kaliu or
Kaliu?
Kaliu. Okay, sorry.
That's okay.
Pronunciation.
I considered having a pronunciation guide, but then I'm like, I've heard from a lot of people that glossaries and guides like that are really not very useful for ebook because you can't flip back and forth easily.
Yeah.
So we ended up ditching the plan.
The main thing for me is that with my dyslexia, like words that I don't immediately recognize it's not that I see things reversed. It's that I have a hard time with words that are not in my common that I use all the time.
Yeah.
For pronunciation, and so for me that's the thing. But anyways, this is the page where Kaluuya and it basically says like, Vaha loved you. I don't know why. It's really strange. But now I'm going to help you. And I thought this, she wasn't sure whether to feel happy or insulted. So you'll help me. This was a great scene in the book. This was where I really felt this scene emotionally. As for me, like it felt very earned in the story, and it wouldn't have been if we hadn't seen how much this character hated humans throughout.
Kaliu has a massive redemption arc.
Right.
And change of heart too.
Right. And which, like I said, as a struggling misanthrope, like I got it. Like, yeah, humans screwed this all up. So one of the reasons why this scene worked for me is because I related to the
The
misanthrope.
alloy.
I related to the alloy, and I was like, yeah, you're right. Don't put humans on that planet. Are you kidding me?
Right.
Right. And I took that position. So when this character has the redemption arc, I'm kind of feeling it because, well, at no point did I ever say, I mean, I was thinking, like, I get it, don't put humans on that planet, but once she's there, I'm rooting for her to succeed,
Right.
in the context of the book. So, and I definitely was rooting for the romance. So it's interesting because that's one of the things that I really liked about this novel is that I didn't think it was black and white. Like,
None of my books ever are.
yeah.
I'm very bad at giving people good and evil in very clearly defined uh what can we say? In very clearly defined characters, right? This person's the villain, this person's the hero, this person's all good, this person's all bad. I'm terrible at that because I myself question everything. You know, moral relativism, yeah, okay, no. I personally have my, an ethos that I live by and what I consider moral. But when I'm writing fiction, I'm like, it's always complicated, right? There's nuances, and I don't like easy answers because I think that's less fun too.
Well, right, and I'm sorry to use an example of my book, but I had the situation where a friend of mine said to me when I first said, "Oh, I'm going to write this book, The Last Night to Kill Nazis," and he was like, "Well, good luck with that because there's no way to write a sympathetic Nazi." And then I was like, "No, there isn't, but um, well, you can play around a lot with like the sympathies." In lots of different ways, and it's going to be more challenging to do it because like the Nazis are automatically, for good reason, considered some of the worst people ever, right? And so
Right.
writing these characters became I became really challenged with like I need a point of view character on that side of the story, and what am I going to do with it? And then I kind of landed on one of Hitler's secretaries that is pregnant with an SS officer's child and feels betrayed by everybody on all sides, right? And just
Yeah,
wants
sometimes you get stuck.
right
Good
and
people get
just
stuck in really terrible situations.
and I still go some morally gray places with her and the rest I'm not going to give away, but like I had, when you can get a character that kind of goes both ways, and that's what's going on with with this alloy character at Kaluuya. I'm going to say it wrong.
Kalia, yeah.
Kalia. Kalia. What makes her or Zer such an important character is because there are so many gray areas that happen at different levels of the book.
Right.
Wanting to sabotage the mission, hating humans, and then having this redemption arc. It's one of the things that is makes her one of the strongest characters in the book, right? And
Yeah, and it was interesting that that whole arc didn't really come to me in the beginning, I will admit. I
right,
knew I wanted Kali to have a change of heart about no, I shouldn't say that. About, well, I should say I knew I wanted Zer to have this betrayal moment with Vaha and restore that friendship, but the arc about changing Zer's viewpoint with human beings kind of evolved with the writing of the book, and I ended up making it a much stronger. Like originally, I didn't even have Kaliu as a point of view character, and then
right.
I realized that I needed it, and then once I have a character that has a point of view, I kind of have to give them some kind of I like to give them some kind of arc. I won't say I have to, but I like to give them, I like to give the reader a little bit more of a relationship with that character.
Well, and there was a lot of morally gray stuff going on in Machinehood too, with characters who
Oh
were,
yeah.
yeah, yeah, and look, we need more of that in science fiction. We need, there was a long time where the science fiction writers that were, getting, sorry, the most attention out there in the world were these old white guys who didn't know how to write characters, you know,
Yeah.
and And so, and it's funny because if you look back, for example, it's like some of the most famous characters in well, I look at like Han Solo is a great like character, right? And then C.L. Moore, Catherine Lucille Moore, was writing Northwest Smith in the 30s, who was very obviously like super Han Solo, right?
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things that made this character work, whereas a lot of her contemporaries at the time weren't writing as good characters, is Northwest Smith was complicated, had things going on that made him like a questionable hero, right? And some writers in that era that were the golden age of science fiction just were thinking about the ideas. And what's great is this book's an idea book, but it's a character book, and it balances all of it, and that's one of the reasons why I loved it. So is there anything, what was the biggest challenge you had in writing this book? Was there a scene, or was there a chapter that challenged you the most, that was one that you had to, was like a hurdle you had to jump?
Yeah, but I think my biggest challenge, and one that, we addressed pretty extensively, both with my professional edits and I did also with my beta readers, is interestingly enough, making Jayanthi sufficiently sympathetic. Because speaking of morally gray choices, right? She does not necessarily always make the best choices in this book. She
Right.
and I had to build a lot more scaffolding for the reader to accept um, the rationale behind her choices. Like, I knew what choices I wanted her to make in order to push the story forward. But I think that the challenge was in making those decisions sympathetic for the reader, right? Where they're not just sitting back and going, dude, what? Like, why would you ever do that? What's wrong with you? That's a terrible idea. What a writer wants, especially for their protagonist, is for the reader to be like, oh my gosh, yes, that is exactly what you need to do. And then 3 chapters later be like, I knew that was a bad idea. We probably shouldn't have done that.
Right.
Right? When the consequences come back to bite you in the ass. But in the moment, I really want them to be in the moment with her and on her side, and very much like, yes, this makes sense. This is the right thing to do. Even if we have some doubts, like, there's no better choice. And so it took a little while to kind of to work that out, I would say, across the novel.
Right. Well, my hope is that you will write many, many books in this universe, and we will break down each one on this podcast as they come in the future, is my hope, and that they will continue to be the wokest of woke science fiction
Yeah,
universes. I,
likely.
I, I'm kidding, but I really just enjoyed this world. It's funny because on paper, if you look at the two books of yours that I've read, on paper, Machinehood has a lot more that would normally appeal to me, but at the same time, this book like really hit home for me. So
Awesome.
um,
Well, there will at least be a second book in this universe, hopefully many more. And my publisher has rather optimistically put a, put a date on it, which hopefully I will be able to hit, but we'll see. I'm almost done with the draft at least, so revisions are coming down the pike. But I will say that this next Alloy Era book will not be like Meru, because apparently I'm very bad at writing the same kind of thing more than once. It's going to be first person. It's going to be primarily set on Earth and have to do mostly with what's happening with humankind, because I felt at the end of Meru like I had kind of given readers an overview of what the universe is like. What space travel is like, what other planets are like, how do the alloys live, and you get a glimpse of how humans are on Earth, but it's very, very brief. And so I wanted to, for myself, delve into that some more. And then there are, as you said, many other places. I would love to do a book just about alloys in stasis, right? And what their lives are like. And as you say, we can explore some of the historical events from the perspectives of the people of Meru as well.
Well, I hope we get many, many, many books set in this era. That is, yeah, and I'm going to do what I can to make sure people are out there reading it. As my mission here as a science fictioneer. So this, yeah. Last thing I would say too on the world building of this book, for those who've made it this far, is that when I like to think of these parts of the discussion as people that are interested in tips for writing and for their own writing. I think this book is a great book as an exercise in world building that people can look to for examples of world building, how to do it subtle, do it natural, do it right. And that's one of the reasons why it will be one of my favorite reads of the year. I'm almost sure of it. Now it's only March, but
yes, it's early days.
It's early days. But I said that about Machinehood, and it held on. It held on to be in the top 10. So
well, I hope it does.
yeah. Is there anything else you want to tell my listeners about that you've got going on? Where they can
I
find
should
you?
say these two beautiful pieces of artwork are the main characters from Meru, Jayanti over here and Baha over here. And if you would like a signed art card of one of those, I'm doing a promotion right now on social media. Post a picture of your copy of Meru, whether it's ebook or print copy, and tag me. You can find me on Twitter, Mastodon, Instagram, and all of it on my website, sddivya.com, and I will happily, for free, send you a signed art card.
Wow, that's cool. Yeah, those look beautiful. Yeah, I should have mentioned that as they're standing there. For those of you who are only listening to the audio portion, this is a reason to go to the YouTube version and see the art. It is they are, yeah, very pretty, and it does
actually, speaking of seeing the art, I will sorry, so I will just interject before I forget that on tor.com you can find both of these images in high resolution, as well as an excerpt, the first scene from the book, so you can try before you buy.
Nice. Well, that is good to point out. So on that note, excellent job on this book. And many hopeful returns to this universe. And for folks who I'm planning on having Divya back to do, I'm eventually going to be doing some panels on different aspects of writing science fiction. And one of those panels is going to be on world building. Who better to have back to talk on world building? So the invitation will be out there at some point. I got to finish writing this nonfiction. I've never written, this is my first nonfiction book that I've written. So I can write a novel pretty darn quick. The nonfiction is taking me a little bit longer than I expected because I'm having to, cite everything and all that. So it's taking me a bit. So once I get
I'm
that
sure
done,
it'll be worth it.
Yeah, it's gonna be fun. So on that note, everybody, thanks for listening, and we'll join. We'll do this again. I'm sure. I book 2, if it's already got a date, then it's got my eyeballs already. So
awesome.
All right, thanks for joining us.